It's Tuesday, June 3rd, 2025. More fallout from the Boulder terror attack. We hear from a key player in the Senate on the big, beautiful bill, and Democrats keep trying to do the impossible. Next on the AM Update.
The previous administration was foolishly given a tourism visa and then was illegally allowed to stay. These individuals are going to be deported, and we're not going to tolerate such violence.
So you'd see a very direct impact. And in fact, depending on how many kids you have, it could be a very significant impact.
We can't get a clean read on how consumers feel about the economy because the data has been infected by partisanship.
And I think Donald Trump understands belonging, understands groups. I mean, you look at it. He gives them a uniform, the red hat. He gives them some chance, some talking points with.
The Justice Department has filed federal charges against illegal alien Mohamed Sabry Soliman, the alleged perpetrator of Sunday's anti-Semitic terrorist attack in Colorado. Attorney General Pam Bondi released a statement saying, quote, "The Department of Justice has swiftly charged the illegal alien perpetrator of this heinous attack with federal hate crimes and will hold him accountable to the fullest extent of the law. Our prayers are with the victims and our Jewish community across the world." President Trump said on Truth Social yesterday, quote, "Yesterday's horrific attack in Boulder, Colorado will not be tolerated in the United States of America. He came through Biden's ridiculous open border policy, which has hurt our country so badly. He must go under our Trump policy. Acts of terrorism will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. This is yet another example of why we must keep our border secure and deport illegal anti-American radicals from our homeland." White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt added more details.
Terrorism in our country, and that's what this case in Boulder, Colorado is being investigated as. Kudos to our FBI director, Kash Patel, for immediately calling this a targeted terrorist attack. That's clearly what it was. But I'd also like to point out that this administration has done more than any administration to curb this violence and to curb illegal immigration. We secured our border in record time, but we're also tightening up our visa process and our legal immigration process. And we know that this individual, this terrorist, was allowed into this country by the previous administration, was foolishly given a tourism visa, and then was illegally allowed to stay. These individuals are going to be deported, and we're not going to tolerate such violence in our country.
In other news, John Thune, he's the Senate Majority Leader. This is, to my knowledge, his first commentary about the big, beautiful bill that entered his chamber just last week and should be debated this week.
Family, obviously, you would see if Congress doesn't act a huge tax increase next year, about a $2.6 trillion tax increase. The child tax credit would go from $2,000 today back to $1,000. The standard deduction would, which now it would be cut in half. So you'd see a very direct impact. And in fact, depending on how many kids you have, it could be a very significant impact. But, the average family that makes $80,000 a year is going to see a $1,700 tax increase.
So just reading between the lines there, that sounds like a little bit more meat on the bone talking points from what Donald Trump has said. President Trump has said about the big, beautiful bill, talking about how not passing it would amount to the biggest tax increase, or at least a 66 or so % increase in taxes. Reading between the lines there, John Thune, I think, sees a little bit more on the table. If you take everything that he said there, from the increase to just the overall tax increase, especially for families, with the decrease in the child tax credit and standard deduction cut in half. Reading between the lines there again, I think he sees not passing this as electoral doom. That's just my take on that. That's just my read on it. I've been trying to find any commentary he has on this because obviously, being the Senate Majority Leader, he has some sway in this process. And I think any commentary from him kind of gives you an indication of where that bill is in that chamber. And now here's this from the Daily Caller. No one would accuse the legacy media of being overly fond of logic or giving credit to President Trump when it's due, but the Washington Post's latest obfuscation of cause and effect is one for the books. Did you see this? In an article investigating the, quote, mysterious drop in fentanyl seizures on the U.S.-Mexico border, the Washington Post explores this, quote, new and puzzling reality. The explanation is complex, WAPO says. Of course, it's only puzzling and complex if one refuses to acknowledge that President Trump has shut down the border. That is seriously how the Washington Post characterized the drop in fentanyl coming across the southern border. It's complicated, mysterious, challenging to understand. They could have just said, yeah, if you shut down the border, if you actually secure the border, you're going to have less drugs coming into the country. That was seriously something that the Washington Post tried to pull earlier this week. How about pulling this on CNN? Here is an Axios economics reporter reacting to some new polling data from CNN, which shows that people across the country are actually optimistic about the economy.
The poll also asks which party best reflects their view on a range of issues. And when it comes to crime, the economy, immigration, Republicans still hold an advantage, although actually those numbers are starting to slip. How did you think about this poll as you were looking through?
I couldn't help but be reminded about a big problem in my part of the world, the econ part of the world. We can't get a clean read on how consumers feel about the economy because the data has been infected by partisanship, really in an unprecedented manner. So,
meaning your partisanship reflects whether or not you think the economy is good or not?
Do people think?
Yeah, if it was terrible data, if it was negative data, if people were really pessimistic about the economy, I'm sure that Axios reporter by the name of Courtney Brown, maybe it's pronounced Courtney, I'm sure she'd be all over this saying the sky is falling. People think the government isn't doing and working for them. I'm sure if it was bad data, she would take it seriously. But no, it's actually good data. Consumers are actually optimistic, so therefore we can't get an accurate read on what the data is actually saying. Well, I'm sure if you've been on social media since the new Trump administration took over, you've seen some of those deportation videos, and maybe you've seen officials for Immigration and Customs Enforcement in those videos arresting illegal aliens for deportation. I'm sure you've seen them with their faces covered, wearing masks. So why is that the case? Here's Immigration and Customs Enforcement Director Todd Lyons explaining why those officers cover their faces.
Their faces and posting them online with death threats to their family and themselves. So I'm sorry if people are offended by them wearing masks, but I'm not going to let my officers and agents go out there and put their lives on the line and their family on the line because people don't like what immigration enforcement is. They are wearing those masks because we ran an operation with the Secret Service where we arrested someone that was going online, taking their photos, posting their families, their kids' Instagram, their kids' Facebooks, and targeting them. So let me ask, is that the issue here, that we're just upset about the masks? Or is anyone upset with the fact that ICE officers' families were labeled terrorists?
It's about the identification, sir.
So that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement Acting Director Todd Lyons talking about how Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers have to cover their faces because there are groups of people dedicated to doxing those ICE officers. Just heinous stuff. And of course, that's an issue to some people that ICE officers are covering their faces. It's ridiculous. Quickly, this before a break, the U.S. has approved for reasons a new COVID-19 vaccine, mNEXSpike, developed by Moderna. The vaccine is designed for adults aged 65 years and older and those aged 12 to 64 years old with specific health risks. It's made by using a lower dose, just a fifth of the current vaccine. Spikevax, Moderna CEO Stéphane Bancel stated this adds an important new tool to help protect people at high risk. Because that's just what we need, a new COVID jab, after we just knocked down the recommendations last week for who actually needs them. When we come back, a few scary moments in Italy, also some new data maybe blowing again, the hole open on global warming, and why Democrats trying to talk to young men, well, I'm trying to find an analogy that fits the bill. That's coming up next. That is the moment as tourists and mountain climbers scrambled after Mount Etna started to erupt earlier this week. It sent panicked tourists running for safety as a cloud of smoke and ash rose several miles into the air. The huge plume of smoke and ash filled the sky around Sicily after the famous landmark began to explode overnight, causing nearby homes to shake. The Volcanic Ash Advisory Center in Toulouse quickly issued a code red Monday morning as volcanic ash began falling over the tourist haven. Now, I think volcanoes are one of those X factors that the global warming alarmists never seem, I think conveniently so, never seem to take into their analysis, never actually seem to add this into their analysis. We could let's just start from the premise that human beings are actually causing the planet to warm. Let's just say we all stopped using internal combustion engines. All 7 billion of us stopped using every single internal combustion engine everywhere. We stopped overnight. What would happen, though, if we had a major, think Pompeii-level eruption? That would basically undo any of the supposed good that we would do by stopping using internal combustion engines. Because the CO2 released by volcanic eruptions would basically undo any good we were doing, supposedly. Now here's this from Steve Milloy. He runs the account on X called Junk Science. He's a global warming alarmist watchdog, follows actual science and what the trends actually say. Here's this. 40 years of global warming down the drain. May 2025 closed out cooler than May of 1985 in the United States. Even 40 years of urban heat island effect couldn't cover for the emissions-driven warming hoax. So 40 years ago, it was hotter on average in the United States than it was in May of 2025. But yes, global warming, y'all. Tim Walz was back on another podcast discussing again this phenomenon that we've seen of young men shifting rightward. Here's what he had to say.
The same road of saying you got a place to belong. And I think this is me just pontificating for what it's worth. Social media and other things have disconnected people more than they were. We were more connected in my generation. It was easier to be a kid when I was growing up. And I've always said this as a teacher. If you don't give a kid a place to belong, they'll go find one. So why you want them to be involved in sports and music and things in school, because they will go find a group of folks. And I think Donald Trump understands belonging, understand groups. I mean, you look at it. He gives them a uniform, the red hat. He gives them some chants, some talking points, whatever. It's not that all that different than when we build sports teams in high school. You belong, you're part of this. It's not so much the policies. I think it's incredibly dangerous, but I don't think we went out to get them. We didn't out to make them feel a part of this.
That is incredibly infantilizing and condescending. People don't like, or the young men like Donald Trump because they get to wear a hat and they get to chant things. Incredibly infantilizing. And then there's this from Nate Silver, who writes recently, quote, although I've seen it written about elsewhere, I was honestly surprised by how strong the relationship is. And we'll get into what this relationship is. Among voters who report poor mental health, liberals outnumber conservatives 45-19, based on data he has compiled and seen. This is Nate Silver. Among those who report excellent mental health, conservatives outnumber liberals 51-20. So the young men that Democrats have trouble with aren't necessarily the ones who have been captured by the conservative manosphere or who are looking for a helping hand. Rather, it's those who report relatively high mental health and see Democrats as being too neurotic and perhaps constraining their opportunity to compete and reap the rewards of their work. Again, that's data gleaned from pollster Nate Silver at 5:38. And finally, air analysis, slightly acidic, mostly necessary. Watching Democrats continue to try to figure out what ails them with different voting groups, particularly young men, as you heard Tim Walz talk about there. To me, it's kind of like watching a dog try to do quadratic equation, or trying to tell a dog to do quadratic equation. Chances are, if you say, here, boy, here, solve this problem. Here you go, boy. Solve a times x squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Come on, boy, you can do it. The dog is probably going to wag his tail, get really excited. He knows he's supposed to be doing something. He just has no idea what it is. And if he ever did, he'd have no idea how to do it. This is what it's like, from my perspective, watching Democrats try to figure out how to talk normally to normal people in general. Young men in specific. This is the last time, probably, that I'm going to address this topic for a while, because it's something a lot of people are talking about, and I try my best to do my best zig when everybody else zags. But I think it's important to understanding their psyche over there, understanding what drives them, because they will never, ever admit, that people dislike their policies, because admitting that would be admitting that they were wrong and that they lost. And the communists will never do that, as I said last week. The funny part is, the ironic part is that Democrats don't even need young men. They're low-propensity voters. Low-propensity voters. They're hard to get to the polls. They could win without them. But the rejection, I believe, stings, and that's why you've seen so much attention and energy They're going to light $20 million on fire to study the syntax, quote unquote, of young men. And then there's the other part of what I talked about. That data from Nate Silver that's trying to quantify in secular terms a spiritual battle. I want to go over that again. What that's actually saying is that people who have an ordered life, that's what they're talking about in terms of those reporting excellent, quote unquote, mental health. Those who have an ordered life, they tend to be more conservative. An ordered life would assume what? A purpose-filled life. Because what is your life in order for, if not for purpose? A disordered life is one that has no purpose. And of course you're going to report, quote unquote, poor mental health. And that's where liberals outnumber conservatives more than 2 to 1. An ordered life, a purpose-filled life, that's where conservatives outnumber liberal voters by an even greater margin, 51 to 20, according to Nate Silver. If we look back on this period of time, the late 2010s and mid-2020s, if we look back on this time, and it is true that there is some sort of spiritual revival in this country, I think we're going to look back on factoids like this as leading indicators. It may not be a straight line to get where we think we want to go. Heck, it may not even be shiny, happy people. It probably won't be if we actually experience real revival. Shiny, happy people, meaning we can do this with little to no pain. But it seems clear to me that there is a spiritual battle taking place. And I think both sides are starting to recognize this reality. I think one side has the higher propensity of recognizing and knowing what time it is. The other side is in denial. And I think that other side right now happens to be a political party that starts with the letter D. That'll do it for Tuesday. Back at it again tomorrow. I'm Aaron McIntire, and this is the AM Update.